Calling terrorism one of the world's most pressing security challenges is a rather uncontroversial claim. But we've grown accustomed to a very specific image of terrorism: lone wolf attacks, religious motivations, extreme ideologies, and most importantly, non-state actors. But how do you protect yourself when acts of terror are perpetuated by sovereign states? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Events like the attack on World Trade Center, the bombing of London Metro, and trains in Madrid are among the most significant moments of the 21st century. The same could be said of the war in Afghanistan, the only time NATO's Article 5 has been invoked, in retaliation to attacks by Al-Qaeda on American soil. Over the last few decades, terrorism has become a persistent security threat to Western states. That is unlikely to change anytime soon. But one thing that has changed is that terrorism is increasingly becoming the domain of legitimate governments. They're carrying out assassinations in foreign countries, target political opponents, activists, and even rank-and-file members of the diaspora. How widespread is this phenomenon? We take a closer look in this next report.
Vadim Krasikov was among the 8 detainees returned to Russia as part of its recent prisoner swap with Western countries. His name on the list of released Russian citizens sparked the most controversies. Krasikov was serving a life sentence in Germany for murdering a Chechen opposition leader in broad daylight in Berlin in 2019. Many criticized his inclusion in the deal, arguing it sent the wrong signal to the Kremlin. With Krasikov walking free, Moscow is being given the green light to continue its campaign of political assassinations. Killing people for their dissenting views is an integral part of Vladimir Putin's playbook. In March 2018, FSB operatives attempted to murder Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military officer who was living in Great Britain. Skripal survived an attempted poisoning with a nerve agent called Novichok. The substance would later be used in another failed assassination, that of Alexei Navalny. Others weren't as lucky. Alexander Litvinenko, another Russian exile, fell victim to plutonium poisoning, also on British soil. Countless more attempts have been made all over Europe, most of them thwarted by domestic intelligence agencies. But over the years, the Kremlin has expanded its arsenal, carrying out acts of sabotage and disrupting critical infrastructure. Among the targets of these efforts is Poland, where 3 people were arrested on charges of attempted arson last July. Polish authorities later revealed the individuals were believed to be working for Russia's military intelligence agency, the GRU. Moscow declared war against the West a long time ago, and terrorism is its weapon of choice.
Acts of terror used to be seen as tactics employed primarily by international extremist organizations. Now, or so it seems, they're increasingly more often featured as elements of strategies employed by various autocracies. To examine this trend and to see how dangerous it actually is, I'm joined tonight by 2 very important experts in this field. Professor Mia Bloom from Georgia State University and Olivia Yanchik, program assistant at the Atlantic Council. Good evening. And I want to begin with you, Mia, and ask you to provide us with a wider picture here. Is state terrorism, or rather state-sponsored terrorism, really something new or something rising in recent years? Or maybe it actually has always been there, we just weren't paying enough attention to it?
Well, thank you for having me. I think that state terrorism has existed for a long time. Part of the problem is that we don't have a definition that is universally agreed upon on terrorism, and even less so with state terrorism. State terrorism can be understood as either totalitarian policies or ethnic cleansing or different strategies and tactics where there is coercion against the population. So I think that states have always been engaged in it, but whether or not we've called it state terrorism also varies. The second thing to think about is what sponsorship means. It means everything from the state carrying it out to giving money for others to carry it out, or allowing, for example, terrorist groups to reside in their territory. So there's a lot of different ways to interpret what state terrorism means.
So, Olivia, turning to you now, and let's talk about specific cases, because especially here in Europe, the main perpetrator of state terrorism is obviously Russia. And you do a lot of research, you write on the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And I'm going to ask you a sort of similar picture with a focus on Russia. Is state terrorism, or has state terrorism been always a permanent feature of Vladimir Putin's playbook, or is that rather a recent addition to the arsenal?
Well, absolutely. It really has been for the past 30 years an important and integral aspect of how Putin conducts and coerces the global community to allow him to operate with impunity in other countries as well as domestically at home. I would say an important note is that recently state-sponsored acts of terror have been pivotal to Putin's campaign against the Ukrainian population. For example, its military strikes on Ukrainian civilian targets, such as its energy infrastructure, hospitals, its schools and shelters, which all violate international law and have caused millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes. And so I think it's important to note that Russia, in addition to targeting assassinations and other forms of upheaval abroad, is also purposefully targeting Ukrainian civilians and using suffering and intimidation as tools to demoralize Ukraine's armed forces, as well as paralyze the functioning of the state with the intent of destroying Ukraine's sovereignty and occupying Ukraine.
And do we see an evolution over the decades of Putin in power in that regard? Because we tend to focus very often, especially here in the media, on politically motivated assassinations, on specific targets, on cases that really make the headlines. But we know that there is a lot of other instruments that Russia, but not just Russia, of course, uses in the dimension of state terrorism, be it arson, sabotage. Do you think there is a trend right now more in favor of one of the aforementioned types of terrorism?
Well, I definitely think we've seen a rise in cyber attacks, which was not always a facet of the way that Russia conducted these types of targeted campaigns. So I think that the cyberspace has become a real area in which the global community has to know how to pivot and to potentially understand that there isn't just cyber warfare isn't just constricted to one arena or one state. It's a global phenomenon, and that I think is a lot more fluid than the types of attacks we've seen in the past, which could often be targeted assassinations or bombings or stoking upheaval in certain areas.
And turning back to you, Mia, and building up in your research, because you wrote a lot about the allure of terrorism, what makes it so magnetic, seductive even, perhaps. If you could briefly summarize or perhaps even provide us, I don't know if there is such a thing, like a universal model or portrait, psychological portrait of someone that is drawn to acts of terrorism on behalf of the state. How does one become a state-sponsored terrorist?
Well, most of the time we use the term terrorism to describe the actions of non-state actors. So Hamas or even Emirat Kavkaz in Chechnya. So in other words, it hasn't really been used as much with state terrorism unless you're criticizing the aggressive tactics of the state where it's targeting civilians. I think what happens is for state terrorism, we've seen, for example, in Argentina, the dirty war, very often it might be that they appeal to individuals for patriotism. And so it gives the state a certain amount of deniability that they were not involved if they're using black ops. And this might be someone who is in the military or paramilitary organization. With the regular non-state actors, like the terrorist groups that we're most familiar with, honestly, there isn't a profile. What happens very often is average people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and feel that violence is the only way forward. And so I think that as part of my research for the last 3.5 decades, the thing that really surprised me is when I've talked to former terrorists or I've talked to terrorists and I've interviewed them in the field, they're very normal people. They tend not to be insane or crazy people, and groups don't want crazy people. Crazy people are not reliable. They can't keep a secret. So I think that it's going to be a different kind of person that joins state terrorism versus non-state actor terrorism. But the state has access to military instruments, paramilitary groups, and the police.
So let's stay on this for a second, because there's a number of things that I would like to pick up on. Because you've mentioned Hamas, and obviously Hamas is one of the many proxy organizations that we know are sponsored by other sovereign states, namely autocracies. We can talk about Hezbollah that resides in Lebanon, but is of course sponsored by Iran. We can talk about Hamas. The Wagner Group is sort of a permutation of the same phenomenon. Vladimir Putin for years kept denying that he had nothing to do, or the Russian government had nothing to do with the actions of Wagner. Is this still state terrorism, technically, when we actually do have non-state actors, but it would be very naive on our behalf to actually assume that they're not performing these actions on behalf of other states?
Well, for me at least, and again, I'm sure Olivia knows more about this than I do, but I think that the Wagner Group, you can't make the claim that Putin doesn't control the Wagner Group when Putin assassinated the head of the Wagner Group. And so I think that the Wagner Group looks a lot like the dirty operations and black ops we've seen in places like Argentina or in Venezuela or in other places that you want the state to be able to claim they were not connected, but in fact they were. So I think that this is where we see the plausible deniability of the Wagner Group's actions in Mali or in other parts of Africa, where they're using exactly this kind of terrorizing civilians in order to have influence. And also, I think the difference with state terrorism is that there's maybe a financial benefit.
Much to talk about in the second part of our discussion. Thank you very much, especially for your insights on Russia. But we know that Russia doesn't have a monopoly on state terrorism. So now let's take a look at other parts of the world. It's hardly surprising when operatives of autocracies carry out acts of terror. But when democratically elected governments are accused of similar actions, it raises eyebrows, and rightly so. Our next report examines other cases of state terrorism, often not as black and white as the Russian ones.
Hardeep Singh Nijjar was among the most vocal leaders of Canada's Sikh diaspora. He was also officially designated a terrorist by the Indian government. The authorities in New Delhi saw him as a threat to national security and monitored his activity overseas. On June 18, 2023, Nijjar was shot and killed outside a Sikh temple in the Canadian city of Surrey in British Columbia. A few weeks later, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said there were credible allegations that the assassination had been ordered by India. Narendra Modi immediately denied the accusations, sending his country into a diplomatic conflict with Canada, which remains unresolved to this day. Similar tensions have been existing for decades between Israel and Iran. Israeli intelligence has been targeting Iranian nuclear facilities and scientists working for the government in Tehran. But not all Israeli attacks have targeted Iranian citizens. Iran maintains a network of proxy organizations across the Middle East and provides refuge to its leaders. Last week, Israel killed Ismail Haniyeh, a key leader of the Palestinian organization Hamas. Independent reports suggest an explosive device had been planted in his Iranian guest house months before the attack. The United States doesn't shy away from these types of operations either. In January 2022, Qasem Soleimani was killed in an American drone strike. He was believed to be the second in command in Iran after Ali Khamenei. And with the conflict in the Middle East escalating by the day, further acts of state terrorism are increasingly likely.
Olivia, you've mentioned that a little bit in your previous answer, but let's talk about victims of state terrorism. Is it always a politically motivated decision to identify a target? And do you think that there would be other, or differences maybe, in strategies employed, for instance, by Russia and other autocracies in the way they identify who's supposed to fall victim of a certain act of terror?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say that I think a better contrast could be in terms of the nuances between different autocracies. The difference between a democratic country and an autocratic country in terms of how they decide to commit strikes. You know, for instance, Russians killing dissidents, or Americans ordering a drone strike on an Iranian general. With a democratic country like the US, when they launch a drone strike, there is a legitimate military or secure terrorist target. And there can, of course, be mistakes, but the intent is to kill someone who is representing a danger to the lives of, you know, Americans and others, including civilians, and whose goals of harm towards others are presumably not going to change. So that I can see it definitely in the case of Russians killing dissidents. They are killing their own people for disagreeing. And so I think that the difference in terms of between different autocracies definitely would depend on the level of threat that they see towards either internal or external activities that they believe may pose a threat either to their power or to the global order. So that's how I would answer that.
So, Mia, building up a little bit on what Olivia said, and also on our previous report, we know that state terrorism is not uniquely a autocratic feature or a feature of tactics employed by autocracies. But we do, as an international community, tend to have a different judgment on when, for instance, Russia perpetuates a terror attack, and when Americans, or even India, which is the largest democracy on the planet, does so, or at least is being accused of perpetuating such an act. Do you think that there will always be differences in the way we perceive this?
Well, definitely there's differences in the way it's perceived. If there's a targeted assassination of a terrorist leader, this is an individual with what we call blood on their hands. And that's going to be very different than killing civilians or killing political opponents. Just from the report, however, and it's only because it was my birthday, Soleimani was killed on January 3rd, 2020. It was President Trump who ordered that, and it was not in 2022. What we've seen is a little bit of a difference in terms of the American administration's attitudes about killing leaders or even killing the leaders of terrorist groups. But for the most part, if the targeted assassination is against a terrorist leader or someone who's very influential in the terrorist organization, there isn't as much sympathy as if it's a journalist or a political opponent or a member of the opposition. I think that it's important to understand as well that targeted assassination is very rarely alone considered state terrorism. Usually for something to be called state terrorism, you need to have a little bit more of the bureaucracy involved. And so it's generally differentiated, and that's why I said that.
I'm gonna stop you right here and ask you for a little bit of clarification. When you say bureaucracy, what do you mean specifically in terms of procedure, for instance?
I think when you look at examples, whether it's Mao Zedong in China or Hitler in Nazi Germany or even Stalin in Russia, it's not just one part of the government that is organized to engage in violence against civilians or violence against an opposition. You have the entirety of the government. You'll have a bureaucracy. You'll have paperwork. We saw this, for example, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In other words, there are offices and bureaus that are specifically intended to carry out these kinds of attacks and this kind of climate of fear. There was a joke once that all the trees in the parks in Moscow were bugged so that the Russians could hear everything that was said even outside and not just inside. So I think we have different degrees of bureaucratization of terror versus when it's maybe opportunistic. To get rid of a leader that you disagree with is something that most democracies don't do. That's why, for example, it for a very long time was against American law to kill the leader of countries, but it's not against American law to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a leader of terrorist groups, or even to kill Osama bin Laden.
Absolutely. And Olivia, turning back to you, I would like you to give perhaps a little bit of a prognosis for the future. Do you think, especially in the Russian case, is state terrorism here to stay? We've heard in the report about the inclusion of Vadim Krasikov in the recent prisoner swap, and many analysts residing in the West actually criticized that move on behalf of Berlin, saying he's a hitman, he had a life conviction in Germany, sending him back to Russia actually sends a wrong example and a wrong message to the Kremlin, because it shows that further political assassinations will probably take place and Putin will always be able to get away with it. Do you think that there will be more of state-sponsored terrorism on behalf of Russia?
Well, to address the specific instance that you just referred to, I do think that Russia is going to continue to leverage hostage situations to get back people at once, regardless of whether we actually give them the people they want or not. That is going to continue to happen. These autocratic regimes are going to continue to grab people and use them as leverage. So no matter what we do, I don't think any specific individual that we return is sending any more of a message than the type of incentive structures that these autocratic regimes have to continue to conduct this behavior. In terms of whether we're going to continue to see, this type of, sabotage, hybrid warfare types of activities, I think we've seen a clear uptick in what looks like Russian-related sabotage across Europe in recent months. Some of those targets have been clearly related to Western supplies going to Ukraine as it fights Russian aggression. Moreover, I think the incentives for Russia to continue to increase its hybrid attacks, specifically on NATO countries and other Ukrainian allies, is quite high, as such operations fall below the threshold of an overt military attack that could trigger Article 5. And these attacks are much harder to deter than a conventional military attack, especially considering that the U.S. and its allies are continuing to push back against Russia's conventional deterrent measures in the military theater. I think these other forms of political and targeted upheaval allow Russia more breathing room in other areas of aggression that are low risk and low cost. And then I also think, it's also important to think about the fact that they have this inherent plausible deniability that they can always lean on, which once again reinforces the low risk, low cost of the situation.
So very, very quickly, in few sentences, how do you successfully protect yourself from state terrorism when you're an international organization like NATO or European Union?
Well, I would say I think the best counter strategy is really a continuation of what we are already doing, as there's no silver bullet for deterring these types of aggression. So this probably means heightened vigilance, hardening cyber infrastructure and other critical infrastructure, as well as increasing public awareness of threats and also further pooling resources in terms of police and counterintelligence work. So, and I also think that the more unified Russia's targets are in these areas, the more effective these efforts could potentially be. So, for example, enhancing communication channels between countries to track Russian hybrid attacks, as well as their other operations.
A lot more to talk about, and I'm afraid we'll be coming back to this topic on the show quite frequently in the coming months and years. Mia Blum, Olivia Yanchik, thank you very much. It makes you wonder if state terrorism is actually as new as it seems. What we do know is that its frequency is growing, but in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't matter very much. Hard power is back in fashion, and states will do whatever it takes to maintain influence and provide security to its citizens, especially in a world with few to no rules. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we'll give you a wider view on the Russian economy and why it stubbornly refuses to collapse despite global sanctions. Make sure you join us next Thursday. Have a good evening.